We will immediately move on to our next plenary session, which is a plenary session on strengthening social protection system in India, being organized by the International Labour Organization and the Institute for Human Development. Start with the welcome and the introductory addresses. I request Professor Alakhin Sharma, President of the 62nd ISLE Annual Conference, and Professor and Director, Institute for Human Development, to please initiate the proceedings of this session with his welcome and introductory remarks.
Friends, very good afternoon, and welcome to this very important session, strengthening social protection in India. I'm very happy that in the organization of this panel also we are collaborating. The social protection issue is getting support from the at policy level. New social security codes for the first time at least has envisaged social protection, extending social protection for organized sector, gig workers, platform workers. I think some of the panelists who are very eminent people, you know them, one of them, including a senior bureaucrat, Additional Chief Secretary of Bihar, Professor Ravi Srivastava, Professor Malhotra, Dr. Sundaraman, Jimoluni. So I'm sure that it will be a very insightful panel. So with these words, I welcome you all and thank ILO for collaborating with IHD in organizing this. Thank you.
I now invite Ms. Mariko Auchi, Senior Technical Specialist on Social Protection, Decent Work, Technical Team, ILO South Asia, to give her welcome remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sharma and Priyanka. Distinguished guest of the Indian Society of Labour Economics and esteemed guest, Namaste, and good evening to all. I'm really sorry that I can join only with the online, but I'm very happy to see that now in-person contact and in-person activities are already going on in India. And it's indeed a great pleasure to organize this panel session jointly with the Institute of Human Development at the 62nd Annual Conference of the Indian Society of Labour Economics. As Dr. Sharma mentioned, that ILO has been working very closely with IHD Institute in recent years, or already for quite some times. As he mentioned, like some of the researches, survey-based researches we have been working on in recent years. And the social protection is one of the most important agenda, particularly in recent years due to the COVID pandemic. And but like importance of social protection is not only because of it was highlighted by COVID, but it's not only because of COVID, but there is a fundamental importance and necessity of social protection to be there, underlined. And then I'm very glad to have this opportunity to discuss, organize this panel discussion and have an opportunity to openly discuss about the importance of social protection and also the future of social protection in the context, in the Indian context. Concerning the since we are the ILO, so I'd like to mention a little bit about the international labor standards. Concerning international labor standards, one of the core mandates is to set minimum standards on labor issues, and there are 16 up-to-date standards on social protection. Out of all, the two prominent flagship ILO standards on social security and social protection are Convention 102, which is the Social Security Minimum Standard Convention, which was adopted in 1952, and Recommendation 202, which is a social protection flow recommendation adopted in 2012. And I think both standards issue may come up in the panel discussion. And also in India, the adoption of new social security code in 2020 is very timely, and ILO is ready to support the implementation of this code at hopefully both at national and the state level. Under this panel discussion, it's intended to approach social protection from various angles, like universal social protection, gaps in coverage, finance, implementation of social protection in India, existing social protection schemes in relevance to social protection flaws, health issues, new social security code, migrant workers and gig platform workers as the examples of the new forms of work. And of course, that last but not least, the role of government, social partners, and national stakeholders to extend social protection flows. And I'd like to state that this COVID, which is actually it's not pandemic anymore, but it looks like in India it's endemic, as it might be said. But this COVID-19 probably gave an opportunity to revisit the importance and necessity of universal social protection in the country. And it's also important to realize that universal social protection cannot be achieved in one day. I wish to have a fruitful discussion with a panelist of the leading specialists on social protection field in India, and moderate a discussion to be moderated by Shara Razavi, our Director of Social Protection Department of ILO. Thank you very much indeed, and then I hope we will have a fruitful discussion in coming hours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariko. It is now my pleasure to invite the chairperson of this session, Ms. Shara Razavi, Director, Social Protection Department, International Labour Organization, Geneva, to please grace the dais. The theme presentation in this session would be made by Professor Ravi Srivastav. He's Professor and Director, Center for Employment Studies, Institute for Human Development. So kindly grace the dais. The panelists in this session are Professor Jimo Lundi, Professor at Ahmedabad University, Ahmedabad. Ma'am, welcome on the dais. Dr. T. Sundara Raman, Adjunct Professor, JIPMER, International School of Public Health, Pondicherry, and former Executive Director, National Health Systems Resource Center, New Delhi, has joined us online. Professor Santosh Mehrotra, Visiting Professor, Center for Development, Bath University, UK. So kindly grace the dais. And Mr. Deepak Kumar Singh, he's Additional Chief Secretary, Environment, Forest and Climate Change, and former Principal Secretary, Labour and Employment, Government of Bihar. I invite him to please grace the dais. I now request Ms. Razavi to please conduct the session.
Good afternoon, and it's a real honor and pleasure to be able to moderate this very distinguished panel on a topic of great significance to India and to the world, at a time when I think many countries are struggling to establish universal social protection systems with a solid social protection floor as an important component. It's a struggle that goes on in many countries, both to enable the social equity, the poverty reduction, and social inclusion that universal, adequate, and comprehensive social protection systems allow, but also as an enabler of the kind of economic dynamism that is needed in order to also see structural transformation and economic development in the world's developing regions. Now, we often hear that social protection is not just a crisis response, and my colleague Mariko just made that point, and it is absolutely true. We need social protection systems in moments of crisis, but also for normal times, because we all face life cycle risks for which we need support, whether it's when we fall sick or in old age, or when you have an accident during your work. But at the same time, we also know that even though social protection is not just for moments of crisis, but also for normal times, moments of crisis do sometimes provide opportunities for building a social protection system, because they just make the lack of social protection system, they make the lack of it be seen as such a missing element of a country's ability to respond to crises. So it's not a surprise that many welfare states were built in Europe after the Second World War, after the East Asian financial crisis. A country like the Republic of Korea made significant advances in building its social protection system. And we live in hope that this particular crisis, if there was a silver lining to it, it is that it made the lack of social protection systems that are universal and adequate become so obvious to so many people, to employers, to workers, to governments, and to average citizens and residents. So with that note, we hope that this will be a moment where some political mobilization and action can take place to put the kind of changes that are needed in laws, in policies into place, and to bring the financing that is required to make those provisions be translatable into real life rights that people can experience as an entitlement that they have during their life cycle. So it's absolutely important that the adoption of a labor code on social security in India constitutes a departure from what so far has been a rather piecemeal approach to social security with separate laws, each with different individual scopes of application. However, as I'm sure this very distinguished panel will give us much more information and analysis of this issue, the adopted Code on Social Security in some ways represents a step back from the approach that was taken in earlier drafts of that code. Rather than codifying and consolidating and expanding the existing legal framework, the code appears to have largely resorted to kind of selecting different pieces of existing text to bringing them together, and really not rising up to that challenge of providing and setting up a unified framework for social security in the country and adopting a systemic approach, streamlining the institutional framework. So our overall comment from the design perspective is that the code does not provide for a national level governance structure for social security, and no organic linkages is provided between the social security organizations. In addition to not providing the framework for a unified social security architecture, in terms of the coverage, the personal scope of application, the code follows an approach which we feel has the potential of segmenting the working population into social security compartments, which really restricts the kind of labor mobility that one needs in a dynamic economy. With regard to the unorganized sector, the 2020 code does deal with social security for unorganized workers in a dedicated chapter. However, there again, the code seems to have reverted to a framework that was provided previously in the 2008 Act. No mandatory provision has been made in the code with respect to the unorganized workers, and the respective powers of the central government, but also state governments, are still to be clarified and listed precisely. So the implementation of the code with respect to the unorganized workers, which is really the 21st challenge for all countries, and in particular developing countries, therefore there remains a big question mark around it that I'm sure we were going to get much more enlightenment on that issue from our panel in terms of what the way forward is. In order to be able to really move forward with the building of the kind of social security system that is needed. And if I may just take 2 minutes also to say with respect to social health protection, absolutely, there's a need to expand health coverage to the missing middle in India and adopt a more universal approach to social health protection that has been widely acknowledged by the National Health Policy of 2017 and also other social security law as well. But at the moment, workers who are working in the informal economy and their families who are not below the poverty line, and we know all the dangers with that, are de facto excluded from most schemes. This is a major barrier to achieve equity and access to healthcare, which is absolutely a critical part of any social protection system, having this social health protection system, which is an intrinsic feature of a comprehensive social protection system and can obviously lead to improvements in health outcomes while also reducing the risk of impoverishment, which is linked to the kind of catastrophic healthcare expenditures that many households have to do when they befall on, they have a sickness in the family, which in turn obviously also contributes to increased if that risk is reduced, it contributes to increased productivity, resources that can be employed within small enterprises, for example, to increase productivity and to contribute to national income. And while different health protection options do exist in India, there's considerable scope to expand upon the ongoing efforts by increasing the kind of risk pooling across these different multiple schemes and reducing the fragmentation that currently exists across different pools. So on that, I just highlight 3 small points. Some, I think, key policy level steps are required to advance social health protection and improve efficiency and effectiveness of the existing schemes. And this would be developing a vision and its implementation pathway to universalize social health coverage, taking into account the huge progress that has been made in this regard in some states in the country over the past decades, by which they have also by complementing federal schemes with their own measures. So that provides almost a great sort of best practices that can be adopted at a larger scale. Streamlining also the risk pooling and strategic purchasing to reduce fragmentation of financial flows and to build a pathway for expanding financial coverage for all, and organizing the kind of mixed healthcare delivery system into really a system that is accountable, affordable, high quality, and aligned with public objectives. And I think a rights-based approach really needs to be prioritized here, because currently many publicly funded schemes have only limited legal grounding. And this is why in the ILO, we always emphasize the importance of that legal grounding. And also are in a way institutionally, not sufficiently institutionalized, which could explain the weak regulation and enforcement of the benefits that are provided under these schemes. So that legal grounding would be an important step. And finally, to achieve the commitment of the National Health Policy of 2017 to increase government health expenditure as a percentage of GDP to 2.5% by 2025 is also really requires now action and bolder steps. And I'll just end by saying that, you know, the data that we have on expenditure on social protection, excluding health as a percentage of GDP, for India on average about 2%. We can discuss that data, but that compares very unfavorably with the 7.5% of GDP spending on social protection on average in the Asia and Pacific region, and of course the nearly 13% of GDP spending as an average globally. And again, on health expenditure as a percentage of GDP, our 2018 data from WHO puts it at 1%, whereas for the Asia Pacific region, we have 4% being spent on government health expenditure. And for the world, the average is about 5.8%. So just a few figures to hopefully help us become more proactive and strong in making more advocacy for greater spending on social protection and health.
Well, Dr. Razavi, actually, your preliminary remarks left very little for us to follow up, because you've you've covered the topic so comprehensively already. Time is short, but before you begin on the substantive issues that I would be speaking about, I can't but mention my intellectual debt to the late Dr. Arjun Sen Gupta, from whom I learnt a great deal at the NCUS, who was also the UN rapporteur on the right to development and on extreme poverty, and Dr. K.P. Kanan, who brought an ocean of knowledge on social security into the commission and drafted its report on social security, which I had to then pilot because of an exigency, personal exigency as far as he was concerned. And the many, many workers who I happened to interact with during the course of my working life, and numerous workers' organizations, big, large, small, all over the country, with whom I've been interacting, constantly learning. I mean, whatever I say is, of course, nothing I say, no mistakes here are due to them. So with the usual caveats apply. So, I mean, a lot has been said about I'll begin with the ILO's approach, and of course, a little bit of my own take on some of these issues, on the fact that the right to social security is a universal human right. And you said this yesterday, the UDHR particularly Articles 22, 25, then elaborated by the general comments and the ILO through the international conventions and the recommendations. The term social protection is slightly more recently used, interchangeably with social security, but it has both broader and narrow interpretations. I normally use a broader interpretation. It is defined as a set of policies and programs designed to reduce and prevent poverty, vulnerability, and social exclusions through the life cycle. But as we'll still see, it's also defined slightly more, more in the context of the ILO conventions and interpreted a little bit differently. Now, while it can include both statutory and non-statutory measures, it is the responsibility of the state to ensure that due provision of benefits according to clear and transparent eligibility criteria and entitlements is made, and their proper administration of institutions and services. All of this is also incorporated in SDGs, particularly as 1.3 and SDG 3.8, universal, which talks about social protection and health. Now, the social protection floor is something which emerged. I mean, there was a social floor discussed in the Global Commission, which Dr. Nair and Dr. Kanan were a part of. But the social protection floor, actually, the discussion on it emerged after the financial crisis. And I'm sure younger scholars here have, or if they have not, they should go back and read the committee's report chaired by Michelle Bachelet, who's now, of course, again, very closely working with the UN on other issues. It's an excellent report outlining the case for the social protection floor from not only from a human rights perspective, but from multiple other perspectives. And then we have the ILO recommendation 202 of 2012, and it saying that the SPF constitute guarantees according to national circumstances. And basically, these are to a nationally defined sets of goods and services constituting essential healthcare, including maternity care that meet the criteria of availability, accessibility, and quality, then basic income security at a defined level, and then the goods and services are defined at all levels. For the younger age group, the children, for the earning age group, and for the older people. And then it also goes on to say that these basic guarantees, there's a lot of the recommendations are very elaborate, but they also say that these guarantees should be established by law. Now, there is a broader interpretation of social protection, which forms part of the Indian debates on social protection. These follow not only Articles 22 and 25, but Articles 22 to 26 of the Universal Declaration. So they include the right to shelter, the right to education, and so on. But I think they are very consistent with ILO's Philadelphia Declaration and the ILO objectives, where, for example, the right to shelter figures as an independent objective of the ILO. And of course, they are also consistent with Articles 41, Article 47, and Article 21A of the Constitution, and the interpretation which the Supreme Court of India has given to the right to life, Article 21 as a right to life with dignity. So I think there is this broader interpretation and motivation also for social protection, which we must take into account. Now, let me just come very briefly to the present social protection architecture in India. And this actually varies, and everybody here knows that, but let me emphasize that for central state government and PSU employees, we have statutory schemes, which are basically pension schemes by central and states, and non-statutory targeted schemes, which are health schemes. The health scheme is a non-statutory scheme. And then for the organized sector, workers below a certain income threshold only, we have statutory schemes which cover 7 out of 9 benefits under Convention 102. One of them is non-statutory, but the rest are statutory benefits. Then other central government schemes and programs, some of them have become, were statutory for some years since the 80s, the others have become statutory. And these include the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, the National Food Security Act, and welfare fund schemes, which were there in existence. Now only one of these welfare funds is in existence. And Then there are non-statutory targeted schemes, and these are, for old age people, for widows and so on, income transfer schemes, other schemes for women and children, health, housing and basic amenities, which I said within the broader definition. Other states have complementary schemes. There are statutory schemes, which came up actually even before the central schemes, which are in the nature of welfare fund acts, and then there are non-statutory targeted schemes. So there is this plethora of schemes in India. Now, if one looks at the PLFS data rather than the administrative data, and one looks at the coverage of these schemes, of the statutory schemes which are meant for the public sector or the formal sector, covering retirement and health benefits, and the data on this is captured by the PLFS. And this is, all these figures here add up to 100. Basically, among all workers, if you look at the rightmost column, only 9.1% workers had any benefits of the kind that were enumerated. 91%, nearly 91% had no benefits. If you look at those, either government workers, for example, who form, of course, not a very large number of workers, but among them, actually, surprisingly, 36% government employees, because of informalization that has been taking place, secure no benefit, not even one benefit. If you look at the organized sector, which is 10 and more workers defined in India, who should be entitled to at least the Provident Fund benefit, the threshold for ESIC is 20 workers, then again you find that a majority of 54% of these workers, organized sector workers, do not get any benefit at all. So there is this whole question of informality and the lack of being able to secure any benefits, even those workers who should be able to access benefits which are statutorily defined in this country. But the majority, overwhelming majority, 90% workers actually secure no benefits. The workers that secure any benefits, there's a great deal of inequality among them. And this I pointed out in the next slide, where if you look at the next slide, you find whether you look at social groups, whether you look at quintile groups, whether you look at gender, whether you look at sector, rural, urban, there are, even among this small group of workers securing any benefits, there are large inequalities. For example, if you look at quintile groups, MPC quintile groups across the population, then only 1.19% in the lowest quintile secure any benefits, as opposed to nearly 29% in the highest quintile. So there is a lot of disparity in the access to benefits, even among these small number of people who secure any benefits. Now, the ILO, you've already given, the broad ILO picture. The ILO report, the 2022 reports mentions that ILO effective coverage, which is the percentage of the eligible population. And in this table, I've compared the world coverage, South Asia and India. And South Asia and India compare more or less, on par, but we are behind the world average on everything. And I must say, although the word use is effective here, it's not adequate. I mean, it's not defined in terms of any adequacy norm, as far as I can see. Yeah. And then if you look at public health, and again, this is something which you've talked about, total expenditure by the ILO figures. I have a slightly different set of figures. India was set to spend around 1.4%, whereas globally 12.9% has been spent on total expenditure excluding health. But if you look at health expenditure, you've given the figures 1.1% by India, 1.4% in South Asia, and 5.8% globally. So India is not a good performer. And now, in the next figure, I've just compared the central expenditures of social security programs, which actually currently form almost 85% of all expenditure on the programs. And here they're basically classified, in the broad ILO sense, as looking at maternity, child, income support, and old age. Of course, the classification of these schemes may have been different from what was done for the social protection report. And you would see that 2021 and 21-22 are not comparable, because the base has, in 2021, income declined by by 7.3% and so on. And we're just beginning to get back to the 1920 levels in 21-22. So I don't think we should look at anything past 1920. In 1920, we were spending just about 0.86% of GDP on all these measures. So, and if you include the states, it would not be above 1 or 1.1%. It's the only one area where states were spending more than the center, and that is old age pensions. Non-statutory old age pension scheme. That's the only area. Otherwise, their expenditure is relatively small. And if you include actually food security, which became the most important source of income transfer during COVID to the largest number of households, without any doubt, although it serves many other purposes, like many of our other schemes, then we were spending 1.5% of GDP, including food and housing, the amount spent on shelter in 2019-20. All of this doesn't amount to very much. And what about health? I mean, you've already said that, the 29-20, we spent around the union and the states together spent about 1% of this thing and on schemes. And and there has been a focus since 2008-9, last 12-13 years, on basically publicly funded health insurance schemes. Private insurance, let's leave that aside. And figures do show some increase. So, in among the bottom 50%, 13.2% were covered by some insurance scheme in 2017-18. Okay, so out of these, actually 88% was some government scheme, some publicly funded government scheme. But this, first of all, this is very concentrated in a few states. Andhra, Telangana, Rajasthan, Kerala, and then followed quite way behind by West Bengal. Secondly, now, of course, the government of India has launched this flagship program called Aarogyasri, which you must have heard about. And this is for supposed to be comprehensively cover 50% households, poor households, the poorest households in India. Now, just to give you an estimate, the estimated expenditure by households on hospitalization in India was from the NSS figures, just on hospitalization, was an estimated 7,600 billion. The bottom half spent about 2,250 billion hospitalization expenditure as per the NSS 2017-18. The total expenditure on the RSBY, total expenditure, including the profits would have been made by the insurance companies and so on, in 2019-20 was 320 billion. So you can see that it's actually has still been just a little more than a drop in the ocean. Okay, and let's see. I don't want to go into the genesis of this scheme. We had proposed a kind, in the NCUS, an RSBY kind of scheme as a short-term, or rather a medium-term measure to increase the access of the poor to hospitalization. But it was seen only as an interim short-term measure in order to give the state enough time to strengthen public health facilities. Now, the result of all this is the proportion of out-of-pocket expenditure in India is almost 2/3. And catastrophic health expenditure estimated for 2017-18 is 16.5% household experienced catastrophic health expenditure. Those who went to a hospital, and it rose to 44% if they went to a private hospital. So that is the extent. These inadequacies, you have mentioned them. And I'm sure Dr. Sundaraman will, deal in greater detail on what should be done. On the architecture of the code, I have just under 5 minutes. I've been very quick. So this was a selective amalgamation exercise. Okay, and what came into the bucket of the informal workers was the Social Security Act, which was in itself.
I'll tell you what I'm going to do is get my headphones.
Okay, so the Social Security Act of 2008 was not only a watered down, actually it was a theatrical water down of what the NCUS had recommended earlier. It provides for it actually provided for multiple registration mechanism, but thanks to the Supreme Court, we have now one mechanism of registration for informal workers, but there are still multiple mechanisms covering the different kinds of workers, where there should be an integrated approach. And it continues a segmented approach between groups of workers with no mechanisms of intersectoral movement, no unified administrative framework, and artificially created domains for central states. It excludes contributory workers as well as unpaid work. And I'll come to that. Other than construction workers and gig and platform workers, no financing mechanism has been proposed for any other informal workers. In conclusion, it does not provide a mandatory social security cover proposed for informal workers within any definite time frame at all. Now, just quickly some takeaways for a right-based social protection floor. I think the first 3 points in this slide are well understood. The nature and the level of precarity have increased over the years and increased, increase and are so well understood now. After COVID, all this now calling for this urgent institution of a rights-based social protection floor, and which the SPF as the recommendation says according to country circumstances, but within a definite time frame. Such a floor has to be based on extensive consultations with the relevant constituents. The relevant constituents who are the informal workers and people who can represent the informal workers are actually left out of all consultations, including those at the ILO. And they are 90% of the workforce in India. Now, the central government has to take the prime responsibility and provide the minimum core level of social protection. But state government should have the freedom to add to it. In terms of the, I'm referring again to the oddity which the code has provided, where there's such an artificial division. The social security programs underlying the SPF should be backed by a legal framework which clearly outlines the criteria and the accountability framework, rather than being proposed as token welfareism or as electoral populism. We suddenly saw a blip before the 2019 elections, and this happens before every election, and then we don't know what happens, subsequently. While not sufficient in themselves, experience shows that statutory frameworks ensure higher levels of accountability and underline the role of social protection as a right and a responsibility of governments. Given the structure of the workforce, social protection in India will be based on a combination of contributory and non-contributory measures. And this was very well studied by the National Commission of Labour in 2002, reiterated by our commission and a whole set of other proposals. The role of contributory social insurance can be increased depending on the extent to which the wage-based workforce can be formalized, thresholds lowered, and employers, including those employing full-time or part-time domestic workers, and can be registered, and also whether gig workers and platforms for whom we have a database with employers can also be registered and covered. I mean, the gig work platform, the platforms have the most extensive database on workers, because they're so closely monitored and so on. So all that you need is a definition fixing that social protection will be provided by those who profit out of the workers. It doesn't matter what is the terms of engagement. Now, even for workers for whom a core level of non-contributory social security is provided, it should be based on progressive taxation. In other words, people who they should pay not on regressive tax. And I think this point was outlined by you, and on principles of employer accountability, responsibility. Higher levels can be incentivized through contributions, such as, and the NCOs had recommended higher levels of incentivize. In order to achieve universal social protection floor in the foreseeable future, say in 10 years, the expenditure on social protection, including health, will have to be significantly enhanced from about 2.2% in 2019-20 to at least about 5% of GDP. In the next over the next 10 years, and commensurate financing measures will have to be adopted. I'm not going to the details. The system should be based on full portability between jobs, sectors, and geographies. For migrants, destination states should provide the necessary set of state-level benefits. It should be fixed as their responsibility. A universal social security registration system, which is not fragmented, will form the necessary basis. While digitization can greatly enhance efficiency and portability in all its dimensions, it should not be exclusionary, should respect data privacy and financial security. And I was very happy that you made this point yesterday. Finally, in conclusion, social protection is not only a human right, and as in the Bachelet Committee report underscored, it increases demand at the bottom of the pyramid. It is anti-cyclical during crises and stabilizes demand. It enhances labor productivity and influences labor market outcomes. And it plays a redistributive function within and across both. These are, I mean, it's not the only redistributive measure we should rely upon. There are many others, but it does play a modest and important redistributive function. Therefore, a rights-based social protection floor will reduce the capriciousness of populist policies, increase accountability, and provide the basis for equitable and sustained growth. Finally, social protection policy to succeed, for it to succeed, labor policy, social policy, and macroeconomic policy goals need to cohere with its objectives. And this is again a point which you made and many others have made. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Sahara Razbia, and I apologize to all the panelists and to Professor Ravi Srivastava, because somehow due to some food poisoning, I was not able to sit. So that is why I just requested to give me. So my topic is, it is from the Bihar's perspective, the circular migration, informal and social, informality and social protection. As you know, Bihar is one of the major source state, and it has been a major source state since historical times. And after independence, the number has gradually increased. Now, this is, I'm just giving just to set the context, that unorganized workers, they are for 85%, the silent, voiceless and invisible section, characterized by precarity, rootlessness, vulnerability, due to frequent change in nature of employer and place of work. Now, circular migrants, they are the most vulnerable among the vulnerables also, because of certain reasons, which from my practical experience I have written. The first is the inadequate capture of data, because there is no data as such of the migrants. The two sources, main sources, either the NSSO or the census, they are not able to fully capture the circular migration or the short-term migration. Therefore, it makes it difficult to formulate escape and targeting them. Second is the insufficient legal protection, because there was only that Migrants Act, Interstate Migrants Act, which has now been subsumed. And even then, that Migrants Act, except just one improvement has been done, that earlier in the Interstate Migrants Act, only those migrants were recognized who has gone through the registered contractors. That in the definition currently, that has been removed. Thirdly, they don't have any routes at that destination. They are bereft of the benefits due to lack of portability. And finally, the most important, why they are vulnerable and they are precarious, that while they contribute to the economy of destination, but whenever the crisis comes, they are left out of state schemes on account of domicile and on account of portability. Now, I have worked in the labor department, and I admit that at that time, I had not actually appreciated the vulnerability of migrant workers, except the state governments are basically, and the NGOs also which are working in this area, they are actually concentrating on stopping the illegal traffic, especially of the children, the child labor. And so that was the main, that is the main emphasis of the state government also. But how to register them, how to make them, how to get them the benefits in their destination state, that thing has been. Now, COVID-19, the unprecedented migration which happened in the lockdown and that, so that has just rose into prominence, this issue of the social security of migrants, because they were non-issue in the decision making. When the lockdown was announced, when the public transports were stopped, nobody thought of that whether these people, which are in millions, it is not possible them to work from home or to maintain social distancing or to desist from movement. And it was simply announced. And the worst part is that sometimes they don't control actually their movement also. I remember one incident where in Andhra Pradesh a special train was announced for coming them to Bihar. But when the contractors there, they pressurized the state government that if they go back, then our all projects will get stuck up. So then that train was cancelled. That is number one. Secondly, when initially it happened, the trains were announced, the special trains were announced. Even the Bihar government said that no, we don't want them here because they will come and they will spread the COVID here. So let them be there only. So they are neither here nor there. Neither the destination state is taking care of them, nor the source state is taking care of them. And I will just give you why my interest again rose in this area. I will just show you 3 photographs which I have taken from the social media at that time. This is one photograph of again one of the migrant families which is going husband, wife and children. You see the irony. The bag which is on the husband's head, it is written good time, and the wife's the bag is written Santushti, and you can see the smile. They don't have anything to eat. It is just the biscuits and other things which some NGOs might have given them on the way, but the kind of smile which is there. And second is more tragic. If you must be all remembering this scene. This was when some migrants from Gujarat were coming on foot along the railway line. In the night, when they got tired, they just slept on the railway line and the train came and all of them were killed. And this third is a book by Binod Kapri, in which 7 people, again from Bihar, Saharsa and Madhepura district, they started on cycle, and he has covered their entire journey of 1232 kilometers. It is now a film also. So Bihar, as I said earlier, it is a major sending state. Intercensual period between 2000 and 2011, around 9.3 million population of Bihar migrated. And the worst thing is, I am not talking about the data. Any major accident, industrial accident happens anywhere in the country, you will find that the majority of the workers which are affected, they are from Bihar. Whether it happens in Ludhiana, whether it happens in Gujarat, whether it happens in Bangalore. And what happens that when there are major incidents, like where 10, 12, 15 people have been killed, then the state government also takes active step. They send some officers, give them major compensatory amount. But when it is singular incidents, they just go unnoticed. So while they contribute to the economy of destination state, they are deprived of benefit in the name of domicile. Now, I will just come on the steps which I think is necessary for their sufficient coverage. Number 1 is the system of registration for their adequate data capture. Now, the registration of unorganized workers was for the first time provided on the basis of the recommendation of NCUS in UWSS 2008. But nothing happened for 13 years. When we were there, every 6 months, we used to hear that there will be some portal which Government of India will be developing, and they will be developing this registration. And then what happened that when the Supreme Court gave a deadline that you have to complete it in by December 2021, then hurriedly in the month of July, they released this portal. If you see the information, anybody can see what is the information which is there, which has been asked in this portal. It is not going to capture either migration or which profession they belong to or any kind of social security. That is not going to happen. It only says the only the mandatory field is that currently where they are staying and for how long they are staying, but the permanent their address is one of the optional field. It is preferable, but it is not mandatory. So anyway, this and the second, if you go through that later, you will find that the purpose was only registration of the registration cannot be a purpose in itself. It is just a means to give some kind of social security or benefit to them, but the purpose is only the registration, and the entire circular only talks about how to expedite the how Aadhaar seeding will be done. If he doesn't have that mobile, then you send them to CSC center so that their biometric can be taken. If he has lost that mobile, which is there in along with tag with his. So no direction till now has come as to how it would be linked to the existing scheme of social assistance. And this was one opportunity where we could have captured the data of migrants, but we have completely missed this opportunity. Second is about the portability of a scheme. I will just say one nation, one ration card, which has been started last year, it has given a lot of benefit, and I can tell it from the Bihar's perspective, because you can see our officers can see where, in which state, how many people, ration card holders of Bihar, has taken their ration, and it is working very in very well manner. Now, I will just come to this construction sector. Construction sector is a very peculiar kind of a problem. In the the number of migrant workers is very high in the construction sectors, as the number of unorganized sector workers also. Now, the act, which BOCW Act 1998, it only says that he has to work for 100 years in the last year. Out of 365 days, 100 days, sorry, 100 days out of that. It doesn't say that this 100 days where in the source state or in the migration state, or it is linked. Now, a very peculiar, which I was very hurt, because by the time the migrants were coming back, I had left that department, and I told the then secretary that the migrants which are coming, the state government registered them, around 16 lakh migrants they registered with their professions, and around 50% of them, which is the normal, 50 to 60% of them were in the construction sector. I told them that you get these people registered in the BOCW here, because they are working in the construction sector, so that they can get, because BOCW fund, as you know, has sufficient fund, and we were given 2,000 rupees initially was given to everybody. Then there is a 3,000 rupees provision which is given for their health allowance and all that. But the department refused to do that. These people are not registered by the destination states. Whenever we raise this issue with the government of India, they said that you make a one-to-one MOU with the state, so that they give they take cognizance of your registration there or their registration here. But unless there is like one nation, one ration card system, unless there is a broad framework, common national framework, in which all the states, they ride on that, it is not possible. The second, I think, which is my kind of a migration facilitation center at major transport hubs at the destinations, because that will act not only just few informations, because that will just give them a single window system where they face any problem, they can simply inform them. Then skilling, again, the skilling is a difficulty, because the people who are going to other states, they are going without skilling. The destination states will not skill them, because all the skill program says that they have to be domicile of that state, and we can't skill them because they have already left the state. So again, then another point is the non-linkage of NSQF level to the categorization. This I had explained yesterday also, that although the government of India for the skilling has given the NSQF level, but there is no correlation that NSQF level has to lead to which kind of skilled, semi-skilled or unskilled, and that is why the people are not. So finally, the circular migrants are the most vulnerable, and they are also the most neglected in policy making. While states can and should take steps to protect their own migrants, it shall not be effective in the absence of an overarching framework by the central government. And the process of registration, we should not miss this opportunity. It should still be modified to cover temporary place of work and the circular migration. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I thank the ILO, ISLE, IHD, Ravi Srivastav and Prasalak Sharma for inviting me to this panel. But after this very data-intensive talk by Professor Ravi Srivastav and a very real-life situation that we heard about migrant workers from the secretary, I really don't know what I can say. So I will take, as an academic, I will take some academic liberty and give a broad view and just talk about three different things which I think are somehow missed or lost. Social protection is a broad concept, and it includes three types of securities. Basic security, and I think even Shara spoke about this, such as food, income security. It should include employment, and social security for welfare and contingencies. So that's basic security, income security, and social security. The recent World Social Protection Report had noted that nearly half of the population of the world is covered by at least one type of social security benefit. But with poverty still rampant in many countries, including India, and extreme contingencies like the recent pandemic hitting the entire world community, is one social protection benefit sufficient? And what happens to the informally employed and the other half, which doesn't even have one social security benefit? We have had a rather unfortunate situation in the last couple of years. I mean, hit by two incidences which have, hit all of us, but particularly our workers. One is, of course, the pandemic that we are aware of. And the other, if I may say, is actually the reframing of these 4 labor codes. And in different ways, I think our earlier speakers have been talking about this. So with the pandemic, many of our preconceived notions of security have been shattered. Basic security, which we thought of as food, clothing, and shelter, needs to consider access, and in this case, even digital access to basic education, school education. Social security for migrant workers, portability of benefit schemes need further debate and policy focus. And the issue of universal basic security has also become very evident during this time of this pandemic crisis and the migrant crisis. The other major impact that the workforce has had is the introduction of these 4 new labor codes. It can impact income security and social security in various ways and has increased the uncertainty of the workforce. And in this paper, we shall consider some of the basic insecurities on education thrown up by the ACER report and some of the insecurities arising due to the labor codes. And we'll take up only a couple of labor codes. Don't worry, I'm not going to throw data at you. So talking about basic security, lockdowns and the income losses have affected basic security like access to food and shelter for migrant workers as the places of work shut down. It also had a major impact on the less educated, it also had impact less discussed on basic security of education, making it less accessible and affordable, particularly for the poor and the vulnerable, women and girls. This is according to the United Nations. And the United Nations also reported that 1 year into the COVID-19, close to half of the world's students are still affected by partial or full closure of schools. And over 100 million children will fall below the minimum proficiency levels in reading as a result of the health crisis. 6.7 million pupils in primary and secondary schools in the Asia-Pacific region are at the risk of dropping out. And the social impact, and the UNESCO says that the social impact of this COVID-19 pandemic would trigger the first decline in human development in the last 30 years. This is the kind of impact that the COVID pandemic is going to have on us. Pandemic and online learning have added to the entry barriers to education, particularly for children, youth in poor households. In India, lack of digital access, difficulty in communicating with the teachers, difficulty in communicating with peer groups, peer support groups, create major hurdles of learning for this large proportion of the student population. A year or two of education that they have missed out due to this closure of schools and lack of digital access could have long-term consequences for their prospects for employment. Sorry, I think I'm hitting something there. Or lack of digital access could have long-term consequences for their prospects for employment. Pandemic will raise the entry barriers to better jobs, such as the level and quality of higher education for the majority of these groups. This will add to the already existing social barriers to employment other than education, such as all our usual caste, gender, and nepotism itself. All this will create a vicious cycle of low education and low incomes. Internet penetration in the Asia Pacific has stood at about 48% in 2019. And despite the rapid growth of technology, digital platforms, a large segment of populations are left out, as we saw here in India. The pandemic has cast a spotlight on the digital divide in remote work and distance learning during the lockouts. This is an ADB report of 2021. In India, we have these ACER reports, which assess the situation in education and particularly learning achievements. ACER 2021 Wave 1 showed that the digital transformation creates the risk of widening economic, educational, and social inequalities due to this digital divide. Among the children in the 6 to age group, there's been a sharp increase in the proportion of children not currently enrolled. It rose from 1.8 in 2018 to 5.3 in 2020. Families have been struggling to cope with this new situation with access to education, because it will affect, they understand that it will affect the learning achievements of their children. Households who could afford it have tried to buy smartphones. The proportion of households earning smartphone increased enormously from 36% to 62% in 2020. About 1 in every 10 households bought a new phone to support their children's education. After schools closed in March, close to 3/4 of all children received some help from families. Schools have also tried very hard, and approximately 1/3 of all enrolled children received some kind of learning material, activities from their teachers on WhatsApp, whatever they could manage, phone calls, personal visits, and so on. 68% of school respondents took help from the village communities. More educated parents were obviously able to support their children better. About 17% children in the private schools were able to, and still about 17% of the schools in private schools, children in private schools only were able to access online learning. And it was 8.1% in government schools. In spite of that, ACER has reported that there has been a shift of children from private schools to government schools. This is something that we really have to understand why. Probably private schools in rural, this was rural survey, were closing down because they were unable to handle this internet access and how to look after the children. So you're seeing this shift towards, towards public schools. Possible education deficits were observed by the ACER reports over a decade. But in fact, the learning outcomes, if you look at the earlier ACER reports year on year, the learning outcomes, the proficiency in learning outcomes for arithmetic and English or whatever language they were learning was improving. But then suddenly after this, in this 2021 route, you see this big drop in the learning achievements of children. So the gap in the schooling and learning of children has increased hugely. From a policy perspective, bridging the digital divide is an absolute necessary. And I think now it's as important as, food, health, and education, shelter, and so on, because this is going to have a very slow and long-term impact on us. The nationwide internet connectivity in rural areas and in small towns, otherwise they will be left behind. Affordable smartphones, tablets, laptops, whatever, otherwise women and young children are going to get left behind. Affordable data charges on broadband. I mean, we saw this problem even while we were doing online in such a elitist university like mine. The children were having difficulty, paying for the data cards because they had to sit in the class in online classes for so many hours in a day. The second issue I'll talk about is income security. I'll be brief about this. Obviously, the four new labor codes, which you assume has nothing to do with the income security, but it does through many ways. But I'll just highlight one, which is the minimum wages. The minimum wages, while it didn't change the consumption method of determining the minimum wage, it has calculated a total of 3 consumption units per family. But it has been argued that assuming that a child has only 0.6 of an adult unit is simply too low, because that child grows over time and should really have a 0.75. And the female having a lower consumption unit than the male, again, doesn't seem to have much logic in today's times. So in reality, that consumption unit should really go up to 3.5 consumption units instead of 3. A second thing is regarding the skills. And this is an old problem, how are skills defined, particularly for traditional skills in the minimum wages. The central government has created a technical committee and has categorized employees into 4 categories: unskilled, semi-skilled, skilled, and high-skilled. The central government will take into account the national classification of occupations and the national skill qualification framework to able to identify occupations. But there is no process of skill premium determination decided over here. And further, the old issue that we have raised many times before, how do they take care of traditional skills, particularly of women? Will it be defined at all? Will there be a minimum wage for that at all? All this will affect the the basic income that could be provided. And finally, on the Social Security Code, as we know, they have merged all these codes, and already I think there's been a lot of discussion on this. But some of the criticisms against the Social Security Code are, first, that it has not really defined the Social Security or the components of the Social Security or the benefit that one would receive from the Social Security. Two, there is no provision for a floor Social Security protection. Three, there is no provision for portability. And that I think the earlier speaker has brought out very beautifully with the case of the migrant workers. Four, there is a fear that there's going to be a shift of the burden of financing the Social Security, which is a huge coverage, from the employers to the taxed general public. And that who is taxed ultimately? Only those who are paying the direct tax. And then if you are going to take something from the GST, it's a regressive thing, but nothing has been determined whether any contribution from GST is going to go into funding the Social Security. So financing the Social Security is the other issue. And the fifth concern is for informal workers. There is no real mention of how these Social Security contributions would work for atypical arrangements with no clear employer-employee relationship. What's going to happen to the home-based workers? What's going to happen to the peace-raised workers, and so on. And finally, the need for a universal basic income. I was never in in favor of a universal basic income, but the Social Security Code does not talk about universalization of Social Security. And during the pandemic, we also had conducted a survey, and we saw that in that period of lockdown, about 70% of the households actually got an income support from the government or from some private source or whatever. But as soon as the lockdown was over, all that went away. And the same thing happened to food support. They were getting food support in that period of lockdown, and then it disappeared. So these households really suffered from food deficiency and income deficiency during that period. For a short period during this lockdown, and this was also referred to by our secretary, in 2020, there was a direct cash transfer, and it went basically from that Building and Construction Workers Act. 18 states paid out. Some paid 1,000 and up to 5,000, but it was a one-time thing. And again, that dried up. So this form of a direct cash transfer can go a long way, and it did go a long way in helping the workers at that time. But the flow of funds dried up, as it was a one-time transfer. This transfer, however, showed that a direct, unconditional cash transfer can be an useful instrument for social protection of informal workers. It does make a case for considering universal basic income. Overall, the pandemic has taught us quite a few lessons. It is for the policymakers to take up the challenge. The legislation of these 4 labor codes has created new nonsense. So over and above that pandemic, these 4 new labor codes has created all kinds of new uncertainties among the workers. Social protection for informal workers then requires a holistic approach anchored in income generation and demand creation. Even these cash transfers would also help in demand creation and other means, and expansion of the Social Security cover. The idea of universalization of Social Security to cover all workers, irrespective of industry or occupation, is an absolutely eminent and important.
Thank you for the invitation, and my regrets that I could not be there physically. I would have very much liked to come, but a little bit of care on health has been required, so I have not been able to make it. I will take you through one aspect of this social protection, which I have been requested, is on the whole issue of health security, financial protection on health costs, medical benefits, this particular area on that. Now, health security is defined as the activities required, both proactive and reactive, to minimize danger in acute public health events, a crisis, and COVID-19 is the classic example of that. But more and more it's defined, as all of you have been emphasizing, not just to cover contingencies, but also an understanding that unless at regular times you are able to cope with the requirements of health coverage, you're not going to be able to do it at a crisis time. So the minimum requirement, and we have seen this in COVID-19, that countries which had much better universal healthcare systems with primary healthcare base tended to do much better in terms of morbidity, mortality, in terms of also less disruption of social life, less disruption of access to essential health services. So in a sense, universal health coverage or care, because coverage can sometimes get linked to just insurance modes, is an important prerequisite and a particular form of which we will be talking about health security over here. Now, when it comes to approaches to achieving universal health coverage, broadly across the world, and this is a broad sweep, there are three modes. One is the social insurance mode, of which the ESIC is a very good example. Most nations have it, but some nations have only based upon this particular mode. It can be in nations like Germany or the Japanese, but it could also be nations like Costa Rica, which is a small Central American country, which provides universal health coverage of very high quality, much better outcomes than even developed countries, and uses a social insurance approach. There are others which are based upon public health service providers, which are national, and of which you have the National Health Services approach of the United Kingdom. But a lot of European countries, Spain, some of the Scandinavian countries have similar ways. And in India, the drive through the National Health Mission and now some component of the Ayushman Bharat, the health and wellness centers, which I've written as ABHWCs, is one form of this. But again, I'm saying that many nations have this as their main or only approach. Our third approach is where the government's role is of purchasing care, which is not the same as the social insurance approach. And they could go for national health insurance, or at least that is being promoted in many countries. In India, the Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, which is a centrally coordinated and funded national insurance scheme, is the prime example of this. But there are other schemes of purchasing through public-private partnerships and different areas of that. Now, India has all three approaches, and all three run in parallel, and all three have had an expansion in the period between 2005 and 2020. And yet we are very far away from universal health coverage, and this is something that we need to think about what exactly gives. Now, the benefits under ESIC, for those who may not have been thinking medical benefits, it's a comprehensive insurance. This is important to say in a time when only ambulatory care is often left out. It covers both ambulatory care and it covers in-hospital care, palliative, rehabilitative, all of it. And it is also for permanent disablement, and now with one level of payment, fairly small level of payment, it is extensible to retired insured persons also. So there is a huge amount of this, other than the social security benefits that also, other than this, very few other schemes actually provide. And therefore, it's a major form of this. I'm just going to make this point that it is a reasonable coverage on this. There are eligibility criteria for which worker is eligible, but it does cover a number of benefits which others have covered on that. Now, one important point is that it covers for factories. Now they have lowered to 10 or more from 20. They have raised the salary limit to 21,000 per month. And if salary rises above 21,000, then even if they were already there on the list, their name could be dropped from the ESI list of eligibility for ESI coverage, which is a real problem because, in fact, most organized workers would be getting about 21,000. And therefore, the coverage of ESCC is fairly low and actually very, in a sense of insurance, rather serious error to actually drop people who will bring in greater revenue and have a lesser amount of requirements claims. Now it's been extended to workers in many more establishments, shops, hotels, restaurants, cinemas, non-banking financing instrument things, newspapers, warehouses, many of these things, and even to educational institutions, private medical institutions. And a number of states are notifying municipal bodies as employers. Now, geographically, for some obscure reason, its coverage was limited to a very few districts. It's not an obscure reason. One of the formal reasons is that you have to certify that medical benefits are available there to be delivered before that district becomes merits ESI coverage. But even today, out of more than 700 districts, 393 are covered, and they cover in all 12 states. In the other states, all the districts are not covered. And in the remainder of the state, sometimes the district headquarters town alone is covered, and sometimes not even that. So there's a serious limitation in geographical coverage on that. Then there are many workers who are excluded from coverage, some of them because they have separate insurance schemes or ought to have separate insurance schemes, which aren't really there. The central and state government employees arguably have a better insurance scheme. But many were supposed to be notified, but now under the Social Security Code, a separate provision has to be made for that, and that not really happened. But the important point, and I found very surprising because in between I had stopped tracking ESIC and I came back to find that the number of insurance persons had increased dramatically. And the number of beneficiaries had increased even more dramatically on that, by the official statements on that. And these official statements are important because premiums have been paid and collected on these things. And this largely happened because of increased coverage of districts, increased income ceiling, more contractual workers in more types of establishments being brought under coverage. So on one side, you have premium collection that is which has a target of something like 3.43 crores. But you actually find that of the population, not just the insured persons, only 1.37 crores or 10% of what is said to be covered actually in the NSSO surveys talk of enjoying that coverage. Now, one point that one makes is that at least in some of the places that I was looking at, that a lot of the formal organized establishment is employing largely informal labor under labor contractors. And these labor contractors are under tiers of labor contractors. So you have an immediate labor contractor who hires a labor contractor, who hires a third level labor contractor. The last level labor contractor is possibly a worker themselves, and they have a group of 10 or 20 workers to whom they are paid. Now, these people have to supposedly, the amount payment is debited from them, and once they say that this has been paid on their behalf to ESIC, then the employer, which for example may be a public sector unit, would reimburse them for that. So that's some whole process by which they have expanded coverage to a lot of contractual workers. It seems to be working in terms of premium collection. But in terms of benefits, it's very difficult to actually see much coverage on this. This is a rather difficult slide. It looks at all the different types of insurance. Do try to bring your attention to this third line row over here, the employer supported ESI sort of thing. 1.03% of people say that. Hospitalization rate is better than those who are not covered, but not quite as good as the other insurance schemes. And for catastrophic health illness, the out-of-pocket expenditure remains high, though less than the non-insured, and the catastrophic health expenditure still remains very high, though somewhat the rate is less than the non-insured on that. So we see that a lot of the people are going to having to resort to private sector, even though they have coverage, and there it is not protected, even though formally they are expected to have provision. Part of the reason is the existing capacity for medical services delivery from the ESI system's own facilities. Now, when I talk to ESI authorities, when I talk to even working trade unions, they seem to think that we have a very huge ESI healthcare delivery infrastructure. But actually, if you look at the norms of what you need to affect coverage, these are very low by any international standards, even by our national standards and public health standards. The amount of OPD centers and dispensaries we have for population is extremely low. The bed strength are extremely low. So in fact, the delivery mechanisms, even in their even in the extent of is much lower. Much of this is perhaps because in this recent period, there's been a huge increase in the number of people covered without a commensurate increase in the capacity to deliver system. Now, the employer contribution was a modest 4.75% and employee 1.25%. And these collections have been further reduced. And this reduction, as I will discuss in the next slide, is not necessarily a good thing, because it comes out of the failure to be able to disburse the benefits rather than an actual improved efficiency or a lack of requirement of a higher payment of this. Now, the big paradox when one sees ESIC is that there has been a huge increase in the amount collected, and even otherwise the collection was good. The amount of money available is much higher than, say, what is available per capita from the National Health Mission. And that arrears are often discussed as high, but if you look at actual proportions, they are low. But the big point is that of the money collected, only about 37% actually goes to payout of the benefits, either medical or social security benefits, despite the fact that a lot of secondary and tertiary care is outsourced on different conditions. And therefore, a surplus of more than 1 lakh crores accumulates, and the interest alone is a very high amount. And this problem is dealt with in entire literature, in commissions and parliamentary thing, as a way of how do we deal with the surplus, where either you're saying you reduce the premium charge or you divert the funds to legally, illegally opportunities for private sector to come in and divert more to private sector, or very wasteful, questionable consumption like the questionable splurge on 18 medical colleges, which they were then unable to run. There's huge problems with it. Now 6 are running, but there's a whole lot of things about dealing with the surplus without recognizing the very poor delivery of benefits that happens on that. This has not attracted attention. It's been the subject of reform efforts over 2 decades. And we have a whole lot of reform measures that have been tried. Some of them increasingly try to make it more market behave as if market forces are acting, but either way, it's not really worked much. And some of this on extending coverage is more recent. Now there is an understanding to extend coverage to all districts. Then the dispensary come branch offices are supposed to extend outpatients, which I think they'll fail to do. And there are increased tie-ups with private hospitals. Number of newer generation of reforms are underway, but not really very effective. It's also important to note that it has, and many of our health sector reforms is about participatory governance. But ESIC at least has a very well-designed participatory governance structure. But if it doesn't work as expected or to the level expected, then one needs to wonder further into it. And this is a matter that we need to actually discuss separately on that. But let me quickly cover 2 other schemes of universal health coverage, the ways. One is the purchasing approach, of which the prime representative is Ayushman Bharat's Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana. It's a government-funded health insurance, the acronym GFHI. It's a major form. It was intended also to, at some point, bring in outpatient care. But sensibly, both insurers and private hospitals have kept out of bringing in outpatient care. It therefore covers only inpatient care. Only 5 in beneficiary hospitalizations get protection. So beneficiaries often are, for a number of reasons, getting hospitalized outside the package and very high levels of double billing. So that in some sense, the actual financial protection that they are supposed to enjoy, especially if it is outsourced cases, where to outsourced hospitals, is much less. And in outsourcing, there is, in PMJY, you will have the card, but you would not get the service, except if there are areas or care where the supplier is happy to give care because his margins are higher. And many of the real hospitals stay outside the scheme anyway. And it leads to a reduction in capacity of rational care providers, even NGO hospitals, because at some point, the way the system works is a bit more complex to understand that even mission hospitals, many of them don't profit from this, whereas the people who profit are not necessarily.
Could you please try and maybe wrap up? You're out of time, but maybe just 1 minute to wrap up, please.
The National Health Mission was another approach to the provision of universal health coverage, and it did do a considerable improvement and strengthening of health service delivery. But from 2012, investments have stagnated. Recently, however, under Ayushman Bharat, both in the Health and Wellness Center and in the infrastructure schemes, there are hopes of really being able to correct some of the major problems that it had. I just take 1 minute on this. So one of the things that I've been really looking at, and which I would see, is that these 3 approaches are not to be seen as 3 silos occurring in parallel spaces, but to build synergies across the ESIC-like approach, the NHM's public service strengthening approach, and the PMJY's approach on many things, and to be able to leverage these 3 risk pools together. For strengthening ESIC and its coverage, I noted a number of suggestions have been made, but there are very many practical ways from international experience, including federating workers and then being able to take a premium from them, which can be tried. And the delivery of medical benefits is a major issue where one needs to get into the details of how exactly it can be done. There are a lot of best practices within the country itself to learn from, but most of these are not based on market-based systems, but on solidarity-based systems. And finally, we have to rethink institutional design, look at the coordination across governance of health sector delivery across these schemes. Different people, ministries operate it, different, it says Niti Aayog, the Ministry of Labor and the Ministry of Health, and between them, how do you get a coordination? How do you get the coordination between center and states? How do you reassert the federal structure that ESI once had built in very well? And how do you make financing responsive to requirements? So these are some of the essential things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. And we will now have Professor Santosh Mehrotra, please, who will be talking about the topic is, can India universalize social security for 91% of its workers, the architecture and cost of a social insurance system?
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. We've talked in this session about social protection rather broadly. I'm going to be focusing very specifically on the principles and architecture for universalizing social insurance in India by 2030. This work is sort of born out of a committee which the Ministry of Labor had constituted, which they had asked me to chair. And so a lot of this came out of also my involvement with the consultations and the stakeholder discussions that were taking place over the years with the Social Security Code. But of course, as many of our speakers have spoken, they were disappointed. So this is the structure of my presentation. I don't think I need to speak to the first topic. deriving from work which I was presenting yesterday in the first technical session, based on the international experience of rich countries as well as emerging market economies on how social insurance was extended within their country to informal workers. I've derived 7 principles that can ensure social insurance for all in India. And as you will see, none of those principles are currently in place. Does the Social Security Code 2020 address those principles? That's another issue I will address. And then finally, for most of my presentation, I'll talk about the architecture of a social insurance system that universalizes social insurance by 2030, and how much it would cost the government is also something I will discuss. Now, this has already been said, Social Security by the ILO definitions has 2 components, social assistance and social insurance. And we have a reasonably good system of social assistance or safety nets based on a citizen. So for instance, we have the public distribution system, we have Manrega, we have the Awas Yojana, and so on, fragmented as it is. That's not what I'm going to be speaking about. I'm going to focus my attention on social insurance for workers as opposed to citizens. And the focus is going to be very specifically on 3 core dimensions of social insurance, which are by and large for the informal workers in our country missing. One is old age pension, the second is death and disability insurance, and the third is maternity benefit. So social assistance systems have been in place for a long time in our country, but unfortunately, and their coverage is quite significant, but only 9% of our workforce has social insurance. So 91% of our workforce is informal, that means without social insurance. And these are levels which you find in Africa. So what are the 7 principles which I tend to derive from the code from the ILO Convention 102 of 1952 and the ILO recommendation of 2012. One is universality. And this is consistent with these ILO conventions. In other words, we are living in a country where 91% of the workforce does not have social insurance. So clearly, one would have expected the principle of universality to have been accepted in the code. Secondly, if 91% of the workforce is uncovered, then coverage can only be achieved incrementally, and the sequence is something that I will talk about. Thirdly, consistent with sort of the international experience, one principle that emerges is differential treatment of the poor. Non-contributory for the poor and partially contributory for the poor, a subject I will come back to in a minute. Fourthly, registration of establishments and of workers. This has been touched upon. I will come back to this. But I think we need to start with one particular fact, which a lot of our academics and policymakers don't seem to recognize, is that we have 64 million non-farm enterprises in the country. 64 million, of which 67% are unregistered anyway. And the remainder, most of them are registered across a number of acts, and there is no back-end merging or any idea of who they are registered with. So the government, if you ask them, which are these 64 million enterprises across the country, what do they do? How many million workers do they have? I'm talking about specifically identifying them. The survey that the NSSO does can tell us this, but we don't know. And workers work in these unregistered establishments. So you can imagine what the scale of registration of workers is. So another principle, of course, that emerges is we need to end the fragmentation of this limited social insurance that exists. What is the limited social insurance? Well, we have the Atal pension, which came into existence in 2015. You have a few million people registered under that. Then just before the 2019 election, the Pradhan Mantri Shramjeevi Mandhan was introduced. Again, 4 odd million are registered in that. But the size of our informal workforce is 450 million. And then, of course, you've had historically the welfare funds, including the Building and Other Construction Workers Fund. And then there are a few other central funds, and then there are the state funds, which have already been mentioned. But you can sense from all of this that it is a highly fragmented system. Parts of the system don't talk to each other. The records are not, put together at the back end, and so on and so forth. Another principle that emerges is that all social insurance systems are mandatory, supposed to be mandatory internationally if they are to have good coverage of our population. They're not voluntary, but everything that we have in the place of social insurance, except, of course, I'm talking about for the 91%, please appreciate, I'm not talking about ESIC, I'm not talking about EPFO. There, of course, it's statutory. The point is that all these things that I mentioned in the previous bullet are voluntary. They're not mandatory. They're not statutorily based. Tomorrow a government changes, it can go out. And finally, I just want to mention that I'm not including health insurance in this discussion, because health services, in a sense, as Sundar was rightly pointing out in the previous presentation, are citizens' rights, and they shouldn't be connected particularly to worker status. So what are the sources, what are the problems with the Social Security Code 2020? I should begin by just saying very, very briefly that when the final version of the code went to the Parliament, the Standing Committee on Parliament discussed it at considerable length. It reached out to a wide range of stakeholders, including me. I sent them about 13 pages of comments on it. 18 of those points were included in the report of the Standing Committee, which went to the ministry, and the ministry practically ignored the Standing Committee of Parliament's report. So that you now have a draft, which I'm going to speak about. Well, you have very good news. 35 labor laws have been compressed into 4. And in the case of the SS code, well, 8 laws have been brought together in one code, but in a rather scissor and paste manner. Secondly, I'm repeatedly pointing this out, 91% of our workers are without social insurance, but 90% of the chapters in the SS code deal with the formal organized sector. Next, social security or social insurance cannot be the preserve of workers with 10 or 20 workers, which is the threshold that you have in the EPFO and the ESIC and the EPFO. Why? Because, employers can understate number of workers and get away without ESIC and EPFO registration. And this happens widely. And there's no provision in the code for reducing or removing these thresholds. And the international experience shows that this approach is flawed. There should be a way of actually continuously over a period of time reducing these thresholds. That's the only way you will actually get an expansion of the EPFO ESI model. Enterprise registration, I've mentioned this, of India's 64 million non-farm enterprises. Well, more than 67% are registered, but that too under acts and authorities unconnected to social security. So how this will help us implement the Social Insurance Code or the Social Security Code of 2020 remains to be seen. As far as maternity benefit is concerned, well, the Social Security Code only mentions 26 weeks for formal firms workers, women workers. So the vast majority of women who labor in the informal sector, the assumption is don't need or don't deserve maternity benefit. So I'm going to be very quickly, moving on to the last portion of my presentation, which is can India afford not to universalize social security? And I would just want to say this very briefly. we seem to be living under the illusion that our demographic dividend is going to last forever. 2/3 of our demographic dividend is already over because it began in the early 1980s. It will be over definitely by about 2040, and by which time our country will be an aging society. It is already aging fast, and not just Kerala, but also UP, Bihar, MP, Rajasthan, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh. These states will also see very significant rises in their elderly populations. And at that time, falling working age population will have to support social security for the elderly. Are we preparing for this between now and the next 15 years? And falling working age, working population will also have to support health services for a rising share of the elderly who will live longer because they have It's okay. I think I'm back. No, I think I'm back. Yeah. Okay. Very quickly, I know I have only 4 or 5 minutes left. What should be or what could be the architecture of a social insurance system? High differentiation among informal workers in India. We know this perfectly well. We have to differentiate between the poor on the one hand and the non-poor on the other. You know, there are several classes of non-poor because there are obviously unequal distribution of income across the non-poor. And India needs 3 classes of beneficiaries in the system or the architecture that we should attempt to build. It needs to be non-contributory for the poorest. Secondly, there could be partial contribution by the non-poor regular workers, although they are informal wage workers, and non-poor self-employed, complemented by government subsidies towards their contribution, as is found in many Asian countries, as I was attempting to demonstrate in my presentation yesterday, while employers could make the full contribution. Of course, for the formal workers, we can continue with the EPFO system. Now, to eliminate fragmentation, and this is very important, as I pointed out earlier, the first 2 groups who are currently non-covered should be part of the same system, since they are the unorganized sector informal workers. While the EPFO can remain in a separate system, if you try to merge the 2, you will get mayhem on account of the trade unions. And there, of course, will be the 3rd category of formal workers. What's the rationale for subsidizing of poor and non-poor? I think this is fairly well known. I argue for the poor informal actually paying only 1,000 rupees premium. The rest could be covered entirely by the government. And for the non-poor informal, I argue for a graded subsidy by the government depending on the income level of the former. I mean, because the current problem is that the young, low-wage earning workers with variable incomes usually avoid entering such schemes, and the subsidy would facilitate them to join at an early age, thus would build a corpus. And the second reason why they need subsidization is that joining prevents fragmentation of the system by ensuring high share of population is covered, allows large-scale risk pooling, sustainable financing based on the solidarity principle. I'm going to sort of overlook these administrative arrangements and the sequence. The only point that needs to be made is that given how short the time is that is available for between now and the end of our demographic dividend, it's important that the government has a simultaneous approach of a top-down as well as a bottom-up. In other words, covering the poor, but also the expansion of the EPFO system. Clearly, mechanisms will have to be adopted to encourage formalization of enterprises, and which could be still inserted in the rules of the SS code, I would imagine, because the code has already been passed by Parliament. We are not going to amend the code very quickly. What could be the mechanisms? Well, stronger inspection services, existence of credible sanctions and penalties. Secondly, incentives, linking payment of firms to the SS fund and workers' contributions to access to SMEs, to business support services, and so on. And finally, of course, persuasion. I'm going to close with some estimates of how much it would cost, because this is the question that everyone comes up with oh, we are such a poor country. Oh, can we support social insurance for 91% of our workforce? Well, my answer to that is the last two highlighted numbers. The total cost per million rupees trillion that you're looking at, and these are at 2019-20 prices, and then there are the additional total cost with annual increments for the 4 years which would follow. And I'm saying that look at the bottom row, it's 0.69% of GDP and falling over time, obviously, because I'm assuming a growth rate of 5% of GDP. And in rupees, trillion, rupees, lakh crores, it's 1.37 and rising slowly. But the point here is that this is the total cost. This is not additional cost. The government is already spending about 1.1 trillion rupees, the states, and another 20,000 crores by the center. If this was to be more efficiently spent and the government was to allocate more resources, then this could very well be done in a reasonable time frame. And my last point, I think I can't leave without sort of telling you this. Between 1880 and 1980, in the now rich countries, public expenditure to GDP and obviously tax to GDP rose from about 11% of GDP in 1880 to 45% on average in the now rich countries. A fourfold increase as a proportion of GDP as their per capita income rose. The size of their state grew and grew. And what were they spending on? Three things: health, education, and social transfers. Our per capita income has quadrupled in the last 30 years. We haven't raised our social expenditure beyond 1% of GDP. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Mehrotra. If there are any questions, if you would please like to raise your hand and specify who your question is addressed to, or if it's addressed to all of the panelists.
If we are closely watching the global documents, including ILO, it's more of supply side policy documents. It fails to account the demand side of information or documents in the sense policy prescription or data sets, all things are supply side. Is it possible to look at by ILO from demand side of information? Number one request. Number two, all the documents are Englishization. Only in English. Entire world is using the document only in Englishization. Englishization in the sense using English as a medium to generate information on labor or anything. That also failed because India, not only India, in other countries also has a different language practice. It's nothing but, if possible, mother tongue sensitization on labor. And last observation, if possible, I think the last presentation made me to ask this question. Since independence, we have only capital budget. If possible, can we think of labor budget in near future? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, the presentations were quite fantastic, and I think we really learned from each one of them. For me, the fundamental issue is that can we see this particular labor code in isolation from the others? And therefore, the definition of work, worker, workplace, which is there in Code 1, is very different from what is there in the Code on Social Security. So at one level, it's fine to say that, yes, informal workers will be included. But if it is read with Code 1, it's extremely problematic. Second, in COSH, that is Labor Code 2, your entire issue of sexual harassment at the workplace has been removed. It's out of the ambit. So does that mean that component in relation to safety at workplace, how does it link up with the entire issue now of what we're talking about, social security? And when I say social security, is the term in which Ravi defined it, as a right, not as a sort of a paternalistic giving down kind of a issue. Another is also, I think the other codes, there is a certain kind of there was a certain kind of a somewhat subsidized social security built in, at least for some workers. And that is your Plantation Workers Act of 1951, which said that yes, that the employer and the contractor for plantation workers will give subsidized housing. Now that has been removed. So it becomes similar to what Padmini and Dev, were arguing about a reverse subsidy. And that subsidy, housing subsidy for plantation workers, which was guaranteed and fought for in 1951, is now to be borne by the district budget. So, which again puts the entire responsibility on, a state which is, well, I don't know how to define, not caring, couldn't care less, in whichever way one may talk about it. The issue of insurance and health particularly, I think also we have to relate it to the huge issue of privatization, not only of healthcare, but also of the new insurance scheme. And there's been enough work which has been done. So really, where is the money going? Is it going back where it is supposed to be going? And I'm not talking of other issues like, what are really guaranteed. But there is one other, I don't know how one defines it, part of wages, but it's also a sort of a social security, if we see it in the broad term, and that is the bonus act, which is taken off by Labour Code 1, and which redefines bonus in the sense that it's now not stated in law that this is the way bonus is going to be calculated. For, of course, formal workers, but still whatever social security they had, that it's going to be decided by the executive as and when needed. So, I think one has to interlink the four codes. It's not just one in isolation when we talk about social protection as social rights.
Well, thank you very much, panelists, for what has been a very rich set of presentations. I have learned much. So my questions and comments may stem from my ignorance and my natural inkling for the big picture, which I think is needed even in this discussion. First, a minor question to the chair. You began with international comparisons, suggesting that the provision for social protection as a percentage of GDP in India is social security 2% and health 1%. So that's a sum total of 3%, where the global average is social security 13 and health 5, so it's 18. So we are 1/6 of the global average. Okay, it would be quite nice to know what it is in industrialized countries. It would help to differentiate Asia, because East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia. East Asia is at one end, South Asia is at the other, Southeast Asia is somewhere in the middle. And what about Africa, low-income countries, and Latin America, middle-income countries? My sense is social protection is eroding everywhere in the world. Second, I think we need to make intertemporal comparisons, and that's my intuitive preference for the big picture. During the past 3 decades, roughly, the age of markets and globalization, we have seen a retreat of the state and an advance of the market everywhere. This has been driven by the dominant ideology of our times. This period has witnessed a slowing down in growth, but a rapid rise in inequality. But what has happened as a result of this ideological shift, as it were, from the golden age of capitalism, sharing prosperities, is that risk has been privatized everywhere, and social protection has been diluted everywhere, including in what were role models for social protection, the Nordic countries, as they moved to the right. Now, I would quite like to know what was the level of social protection in each of these geographical regions or economic groupings of the world, say in 1980, okay, when inequality was modest. My feeling is that it would have been much higher. So the sad reality is that at a time when the need for social protection is greater than ever before, social protection itself is much less than ever before, almost everywhere. Yeah, perhaps Germany, some parts of the European Union, but the US, it's slipped very badly. Third, I think it is important to situate your discussion on social protection in its wider context. In a sense, outcomes in terms of social protection are shaped by macroeconomic policies, They are shaped by social sector policies. They're shaped not only by labor market policies, but also by structural changes in the nature of work. Governments have moved to balanced budgets, reducing debt, managing inflation. Social protection is very low, not visible on their radar screens. Large private sector firms have changed the nature of work. In India, we call it the informal workers. But in the United States, where real wages haven't increased for 90% of the workforce, almost, since the mid-70s, you have a situation where work is casualized. People no longer have superannuation benefits, healthcare benefits. They work on contract for limited durations, often for home specified purposes. So it's the mix of this, what has happened to macroeconomic policies, what has happened to social sector policies, where resources allocated have diminished greatly, and what is happening with how markets are transforming thinking among large national and international firms. At the end, one trivial point. I have a sense of discomfiture about treating transfer payments in humanitarian disaster situations as social protection. It is not social protection.
It's up to us to actually do things in regional languages, mother language, whatever languages we want to. Let's not just leave everything to the ILO. Secondly, of course, you can't see any of the codes in isolation. They're all absolutely interrelated, and the underlying logic was to promote what they call the ease of business, right? All across the codes, and towards the very end, they tried to harmonize some of the definitions, but it still remains very, very problematic the way it is done. And the only code which tries to address informal workers, and as Santosh says, 1/10 of the thing is the social security codes. And this actually just picked up that absolutely useless 2008 Act, which was thrown at us after everything. And then just added a few things to it. So, frankly, it was not these 91% workers are not a part of any of the labor codes. They're not a part of the labor codes. And yes, there has been dilution. So that's absolutely true. Deepak, just all that I can say is that for whatever it is worth, and one can critique that report, but the Social Protection Report 2022, ILO Social Protection Reports, gives a countrywide, regional, as well as global picture, and it does so both cross-sectionally and temporally. So, of course, as I said, one needs to look at it critically. One doesn't need to look at it as a faith document, but this needs to be said. And yes, absolutely, outcomes are shaped by wider policies, but it is also true that a right-based social protection policy also influences other outcomes. So it's a question of which way you want to look at it. Right now, since the panel was social protection, I'd rather focus on what a right-based social protection floor can do to other outcomes, including labor market outcomes. And there is a whole set of things which it can do. And there is a whole set of documented empirical evidence across the continents of what it has done, from Brazil to Latin America to other countries. So, I would rather draw on that.
Obviously one has to look at the four codes together. There isn't any doubt about that. And there's a lot of confusion there if you really look through all the four codes together, because they have redefined employer-employee. And employer includes even the contract worker, contractor. So there's a lot of confusion there now as who's the employer-employee. And so when you look at each of the provisions which are there in each of the codes, then there is this issue of, who are they talking about and how. The other thing that they have done is that they have different thresholds for different benefits or whatever in the different codes. So there again, one has to look at that carefully and then see. I had made a full PPT on some of these, interlinked things between the four codes. But yeah, one has to study that carefully to be able to understand. It's not the social security, but something is defined here and then it's just not like the gig workers, for example. It's defined in the social security code. Nowhere else in the whole scheme of things it is even talked about. So what happens to the gig workers when it comes to anything else like wages or all the other three codes?
Thank you. Maybe I'll take this chance to see if Professor Sundaraman, if you would like to respond to any of the questions or comments, please come in now.
No, I said I'll give it a pass because I think many are comments, and on the others have responded much closer to what their work on that.
Okay, thank you. No worries. And I'll pass now.
Right. In the interest of time, I'm only going to respond to Deepak's question, actually. Deepak, just to give you a flavor of where India stands relative to low-income countries, low-middle-income countries, upper-middle-income countries, and high-income countries. And I'm going to, the numbers I'm going to cite are in that order. India, as you know, is an LMIC, has been so for 15 years, since 2007. And it is LICs which spend 1% of GDP on social protection. And that's what we spend. LMICs spend about 4%. UMICs spend 8% of GDP. And HICs spend 16%. And all these numbers are excluding health. Okay? Excluding health. You asked about Asia. Well, I was presenting this in a separate piece, sort of invited piece from the IHD yesterday in a technical session. And you look at the Asia numbers, and these numbers are again excluding health. So China, which is UMIC, 4 countries in Asia, 7.2%. Thailand, 3%, Vietnam, 4.3%. While, we are just over 1. And Japan, 16. All this is excluding health. And South Korea is 6.3. And then I could give you the numbers for health, and those are add-ons, and I won't bother. So it gives you a feel for how much further we have to go, which is the reason why I closed my presentation by talking about how rich countries increased their public spending, and the size of the state grew and grew and grew over a 100-year period as their per capita incomes rose from 11% to 45%, while the size of our state has remained the same, as our tax to GDP ratio for general government has remained the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So with that, I would like to again thank our distinguished panel for their excellent presentations. And I hope that this has whetted your appetite to go out and continue to the discussion informally. And I believe dinner is awaiting you downstairs. So thank you very much to the organizers and our collaborators in this panel, and to all the audience who engaged, and to our panelists.